It was a Tuesday in late October of 1980 when 28-year-old Jessie Morrow stood in the doorway of her kitchen and watched her husband throw the last of his things into the bed of his Chevy. Carl didn't look back. He didn't slam anything. He didn't shout the way he had for months. He just climbed into the cab, turned the engine over, and drove down that long gravel lane with the kind of calm that told her he'd been planning this exit for weeks. The taillights winked once at the curve where the road met the county blacktop, and then he was gone. She was left with 900 acres of Nebraska sandhills, a calving season 6 weeks away, a herd of 280 Hereford cows that needed feeding every single morning whether the world was ending or not, and a silence so wide it could swallow a person whole. Let me tell you about that silence. It wasn't the peaceful kind you read about in books, where someone goes to the country to find themselves. It was the silence of being the only human heartbeat on a piece of land that stretched in every direction to the horizon. The wind came through the gaps in the barn siding and made a sound like a low moan, and the cattle lowed back at it from the corrals, and somewhere a gate hinge was creaking in a rhythm that sounded almost like a voice, trying to say something she couldn't quite make out. The house itself felt wrong without another person in it. Too many rooms, too many echoes. Carl had called the ranch a prison. He had called her father a stubborn old man who'd rather die poor than admit the world had changed. He had called her loyalty to this ground a kind of sickness. And maybe he was right about one thing. Her father, Emmett Morrow, had died right here on this land 18 months earlier, slumped against the wheel well of his old International pickup with a heart that just stopped between one breath and the next. He was 61 years old and had never spent a night in a hospital and never owed a dollar he couldn't pay back by sundown. The land had been his church, his bank, his whole philosophy of living, and he had left every acre of it to Jessie because he trusted her to understand something Carl never would. But I'm getting ahead of the story. The morning after Carl left, Jessie went out to feed the herd the way she always did. The stock tank heater had failed overnight, and a half-inch sheet of ice covered the water. She broke it with the back of an axe, the shock of the cold traveling up her arms to her shoulders. The cows came in slow, their breath rising like small prayers in the freezing air. She counted them. She always counted them. Her father had taught her that. "You count every morning and every evening," he told her once, leaning on a fence post with a coffee mug that had lost its handle 10 years prior. "The day you stop counting is the day you start losing." She counted 280, all present. The feed truck, a 1968 Ford with a flatbed her father had welded himself, started on the third try. The engine had a miss in it, a stuttering skip every few seconds that Jessie could hear as clearly as a wrong note in a hymn. She knew what it was. Number 4 cylinder, fouled plug, maybe a cracked distributor cap. She'd get to it. There was always something to get to. Now, let me explain the world Jessie was living in. By the fall of 1980, the cattle business in the Nebraska sandhills was caught in a kind of fever dream. Interest rates were climbing like a thermometer in July. The Federal Reserve, trying to kill inflation, had pushed borrowing costs to levels that would have made a loan shark blush. At the same time, the men who ran the big ranches were still spending like it was 1975. When cattle prices had spiked and every ag lender in the state was practically begging you to take their money. Buy more land, run more head, build a new set of corrals with a hydraulic squeeze chute and a covered working facility. Get big or get buried. Jessie's neighbors had listened. Doug Retzlaff to the north had taken out a $250,000 note to buy an adjacent section and stock it with expensive Simmental Cross heifers. The Burkholder brothers to the west had built a feedlot that could handle 1,000 head, financed to the last bolt. Even old Harlan Sweeney, who should have known better at his age, had mortgaged his home place to buy a brand new diesel tractor and a round baler that cost more than most people's houses. They all looked at Jesse's operation and saw what Carl had seen, an old ranch running on old equipment with old methods. No squeeze chute, just a hand-built wooden corral system her father had designed with swing gates that could be worked by one person. No modern baler, just a small square baler from the 1960s that still kicked out tight, clean bales because Emmett Morrow had maintained it with an obsessive precision that bordered on devotion. No debt either, but they didn't think about that part. They thought about the young woman trying to run a cow-calf operation alone in a country where the winters could kill you just for standing still too long. The first person to suggest she sell was Mr. Caldwell at the Platte Valley Savings and Loan. She went to see him the week after Carl left, not to ask for money, but to make sure the ranch's small operating line was still in order. Mr. Caldwell was a tall man with reading glasses that sat on the end of his nose like they were always about to fall off. He had the careful, measured voice of someone who spent his days putting numbers into columns and watching the columns not add up. "Jesse," he said, folding his hands on the desk, "I've looked at your numbers. The operating loan is current. I'll grant you that. Your father was meticulous, but the reality is you're heading into winter with a calving season coming, no hired help, and a husband who's, well," he paused, choosing his words, "no longer in the picture. The Retzlaff Group has expressed interest in your north pastures. Consistently, the price they're offering is more than fair. The north pastures aren't for sale, Mr. Caldwell." He took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Be practical. You're one woman on 900 acres, with nearly 300 head of cattle, about to start calving in the dead of a Nebraska winter. I knew your father, and I respected him deeply, but even Emmett would have. My father would have fed the cows and fixed the truck and gone to bed," Jesse said. "That's what I'm going to do." Mr. Caldwell put his glasses back on and looked at her the way a doctor looks at a patient who refuses treatment, with concern and with the quiet certainty that he would be proven right. She drove home in the dark. The highway was empty, except for the occasional freight truck heading east, its headlights sweeping over the brown grass of the ditches. She thought about Carl. She thought about the way he used to talk about moving to Omaha, getting a job at the meatpacking plant, making real money. He never understood that the money wasn't the point. The point was the morning count. The point was the sound of a healthy calf hitting the ground. The point was knowing that this grass had fed these cattle for 3 generations of Morrows, and that walking away from it would be a kind of death that didn't involve dying. Her father's workshop was a low cinder block building attached to the east side of the main barn. It had a concrete floor stained with decades of oil and hydraulic fluid, a wood stove in the corner that could heat the space to shirt-sleeve temperature even in January, and fluorescent lights that buzzed and flickered with a personality of their own. Along one wall, hung on pegboard with outlines drawn in black marker, so every tool had a specific silhouette to return to, was Emmett Morrow's tool collection. Not expensive tools, working tools, a set of Craftsman wrenches he'd bought in 1962, a torque wrench he'd calibrated himself, vice grips with tape on the handles because the original rubber had worn through 20 years ago. On a shelf above the workbench sat 7 3-ring binders, black, each one labeled on the spine in Emmett's careful block lettering. Ford truck, 1968, baler, NH-268, International 806, fencing, well pumps, cattle health, general. Inside each binder were pages and pages of notes, dates, part numbers, torque specifications, diagrams drawn by hand with a ruler and a felt-tip pen. When the International Tractor had thrown a rod bearing in 1974, there was a page that described exactly what happened, what parts were ordered, what the clearances were, and how long the repair took. When the well pump on the south pasture had failed in the drought of 1976, there was a step-by-step procedure for pulling the pump, checking the leathers, and reassembling it. Every piece of knowledge Emmett Morrow had earned through 40 years of sweat and error was in those binders. Have you ever met someone who could walk into a barn, listen for 10 seconds, and tell you which bearing was going bad on which piece of equipment? That was Emmett. He taught Jessie not with lectures, but with quiet mornings in the shop where he'd hand her a wrench and say, "Take the cap off that fuel filter and tell me what you see." And she'd look and say, "There's water at the bottom." And he'd nod and say, "Good. Now you know why she's been hard to start. Water's heavier than diesel. It settles. You drain it. She'll fire right up." He taught her to think in systems. Everything was connected. The quality of the hay depended on when you cut it and how you cured it. The health of the calves depended on the mineral content of the pasture. The pasture depended on the rotation, on giving the grass time to recover. Take one piece out and the whole thing wobbled. Ranching isn't about cattle, he told her once, walking the fence line in the golden light of a September evening. It's about grass. Take care of the grass, and the grass takes care of everything else. The minute you overstock, the minute you push too hard, you've broken the deal. Jessie's first calving season alone began on December 14th with a heifer that decided to go into labor at 2 in the morning during a snowstorm. Jessie had been checking the heavy pen every 3 hours, sleeping in her clothes on the couch with her boots by the door and an alarm clock set to go off like a small bomb in the darkness. She pulled on her Carhartt coveralls, grabbed the calving kit her father had assembled, a canvas bag with chains, handles, iodine, and a bulb syringe, and walked out into the blowing snow. The heifer was down in the corner of the pen, straining. Jessie knelt behind her in the snow and checked the presentation. 2 front feet and a nose. Textbook. But the calf was big and the heifer was young, and after 20 minutes of pushing, nothing was moving. Jessie looped the calving chains around the calf's front legs, just above the fetlocks, and pulled in time with the contractions, steady and firm, the way her father had shown her. "You're not yanking it out," he'd said. "You're helping." There's a difference. The calf came in a rush of fluid and steam into the frozen world. A bull calf, red and white, shaking his head and blinking at the snow. Jessie cleared his nostrils, dipped his navel in iodine, and sat back on her heels in the slush, breathing hard, her arms trembling. The heifer turned and began licking her calf with the fierce, automatic devotion of new motherhood. The snow kept falling. Jessie's knees were soaked through. Her back ached, and she thought, with a clarity that felt like light breaking through clouds, "I can do this." The rest of that winter was a long war of attrition against cold, exhaustion, and the relentless needs of living animals. She lost 4 calves, 2 to scours, 1 to a blizzard that caught her with cattle in the wrong pasture, and 1 stillborn that she pulled from a cow at midnight and carried to the dead pile in her arms, its small body still warm and impossibly heavy with all the life it never got to live. Each loss was a wound. Each one made her question everything. But she kept the count. She wrote the numbers in a ledger her father had started years before. The same ledger where his handwriting gave way to hers somewhere around page 40. Spring came the way it always does in the sandhills, reluctantly and all at once. One week the world was brown and frozen. The next, the grass was pushing green through the old stubble, and the meadowlarks were back on the fence posts, singing their hearts out to nobody in particular. Jessie turned the pears out onto the spring pasture and watched them spread across the hill. the calves kicking and running in that ridiculous way young things do when they first discover they have legs. Now let me tell you what was happening to everyone else. By the spring of 1981, the interest rates had climbed past 18% and were still rising. The cattle market had softened, feed costs were up, and the men who had borrowed big were starting to feel the walls closing in. Doug Retzlaff's new heifers had a terrible calving season. 30% losses because he'd bought genetics he didn't understand and stocked pasture he hadn't had time to learn. His loan payments were due and his calf crop was half what he'd projected. The Burkholder brothers' feedlot was running at a loss because the cost of corn had outpaced the price of finished beef, a margin squeeze that their banker had assured them was temporary. It was not temporary. Harlan Sweeney couldn't make the payment on his tractor. The dealer sent a man with a flatbed trailer to repossess it on a Wednesday afternoon, while Harlan stood in his yard and watched a machine he'd owned for less than a year get chained down and hauled away. For sale signs began appearing on fence posts along the highway, then auction notices in the county newspaper, then, worse, the quiet sales that happened behind closed doors, where a family that had been on the same ground for 80 years signed papers in a lawyer's office and drove away with nothing but a check that didn't come close to covering what they'd lost. Jessie watched it happen. She attended 2 of the auctions, not to buy but to bear witness. She stood at the back of the crowd and watched men she'd known her whole life bid on the dismantled pieces of their neighbors' lives. A tractor went for 1/3 of what it was worth. A hay rake sold for less than the price of the tires on it. The wives stood by the trucks with their arms crossed, not crying, just staring at something in the middle distance that nobody else could see. It was a hard thing to watch. It was a harder thing to understand how it had happened so fast. Through it all, Jessie's ranch held, not because she was smarter or luckier than her neighbors, but because she carried no weight that wasn't her own. Her equipment was old and paid for. Her operating loan was small and current. Her herd was modest but healthy. Her grass was strong. Because she'd followed her father's rotation, never putting more cattle on a pasture than it could carry, always leaving enough residual growth to protect the roots through winter. She wasn't prospering. She was making it. But in 1982, in the Nebraska Sandhills, making it was the equivalent of a miracle. There was a night in February of that second year when the weight of it nearly took her down. The old Ford's transmission had finally given out. Not just a slipping gear, but a catastrophic failure, metal on metal, the kind of sound that makes your stomach drop because you know it's not a $50 fix. Without the truck, she couldn't feed. Without feeding, the cattle would starve. She stood in the workshop at 11 o'clock at night, looking at the transmission case she'd pulled by herself, using a floor jack and 2 jack stands, and a vocabulary of profanity she hadn't known. She possessed, and she felt something break inside her that wasn't mechanical. It was the feeling of being utterly, completely alone, was coming to help. Nobody was going to tell her it would be all right. The walls of the shop with their neat rows of tools and the shelf of black binders seemed to close in, and she sat down on an overturned bucket and put her face in her hands. She didn't cry. She was too tired to cry. She just sat there breathing, feeling the cold concrete through her boots. After a while, she reached up to the shelf and pulled down the binder marked Ford Truck, 1968. She opened it not because she had a plan, but because her father's handwriting was the closest thing to his voice that she had left. She flipped through pages of fuel system notes and brake adjustments until she found the transmission section, and there, paper clipped to the inside of the back cover, was a small index card she had never noticed before. On it, in Emmett's steady hand, were 3 sentences. This truck has more life in it than people think. Don't rush. The answer is always in the details." She read it twice. She read it a third time. Then she set the card on the workbench where she could see it, got off the bucket, and went back to work. It took her 4 days. She worked from the binder's diagrams and from a Chilton manual so old the binding had been repaired with duct tape. She pulled the transmission apart on the shop floor, laying each component on clean rags in the order of removal, exactly the way Emmett had taught her. A cluster gear with 3 broken teeth, probably weakened by years of hard use and finished off by the cold. She called 6 salvage yards before she found a replacement in a junkyard outside of Grand Island. It cost her $40. She drove a neighbor's truck to get it. A neighbor named Ed Macklin, who didn't ask questions and didn't offer advice, just handed her the keys and said, "Bring it back with gas in it." When the Ford fired up and she eased it into first gear and felt the transmission catch clean and smooth, she sat in the cab for a full minute with her hands on the wheel, not moving, just listening to the engine idle. The miss was still there. Number 4 cylinder. She'd get to it. The season turned. The crisis deepened. By the fall of 1982, nearly a quarter of the ranches in the county had changed hands. The survivors were leaner, quieter, and deeply suspicious of anyone wearing a tie. The community had been broken and was putting itself back together with the slow, painful work of people who had learned, at great cost, the difference between wealth and solvency. It was on a gray afternoon in early November that Mr. Caldwell's Lincoln appeared at the end of Jessie's driveway. She saw it from the corral where she was pregnancy-checking heifers with a borrowed bull, a low-tech method that involved patience and observation rather than the ultrasound machines the progressive outfits used. Mr. Caldwell got out of his car slowly. He was wearing his town coat, but the wind flattened it against him in a way that made him look smaller than he was. He walked to the fence and stood there, watching her work. She finished what she was doing, made a note in her pocket notebook, and walked over to him. He looked at the herd, at the corrals, with their hand-built swing gates, at the old square baler parked neatly under a lean-to with a tarp over its pickup chamber. He looked at the fields beyond, where the grass had been grazed down to a careful, even height, not scalped the way overstocked pastures were, but managed, controlled, left with enough growth to hold the soil through winter. "Your father built these corrals," he said. It wasn't a question. He did. One person can work them alone. That was the point, wasn't it? That was the point. Mr. Caldwell took off his glasses and cleaned them with a handkerchief, a gesture Jessie recognized as his way of buying time before saying something difficult. "I've closed 4 ranch loans this year," he said quietly. "Foreclosed, I mean. 4 families. People I've known for 30 years. He put his glasses back on and looked at her directly. "I drove out to the Retzlaff place last week to do the final walkthrough before the auction. The corrals he built, the fancy hydraulic system, the covered working facility, none of it was maintained. The concrete was cracked. The hydraulics were leaking. He spent a fortune building it and nothing keeping it up. He couldn't. He was too busy making payments to do the actual work." He paused. "I told you to sell, Jessie. 2 years ago, I sat in my office and told you to be practical. I remember. I was wrong." The words came out like they cost him something. "I looked at your situation and saw a problem. I should have looked at your father's books and seen a philosophy." He glanced at the corrals again. "Emmett designed everything on this place so one person could run it. That wasn't stubbornness. That was planning." "It was both," Jessie said, and for the first time in a long time, she smiled. Mr. Caldwell reached out his hand. Jessie looked at it, at the clean, soft fingers of a man who worked indoors, and she held up her own hand, roughed and dirty from the afternoon's work. "You sure?" she said. He nodded. She shook his hand, and something shifted between them that was more than a handshake. It was an acknowledgement that the rules had changed, and she had been living by the new ones all along. 2 weeks later, on a Sunday evening, a truck she hadn't seen in 2 years pulled up to the house. Carl got out. He was thinner, harder looking. The oil field swagger that had replaced his rancher's gait was gone, replaced by something emptier. He stood by his truck and looked at the ranch the way a man looks at a house he used to live in, cataloging everything that was the same and everything that was different. The fences were tight, the corrals were solid, the hay was stacked in neat rows under tarps. The cattle in the near pasture were heavy and slick, their winter coats coming in thick and healthy. It was a ranch that looked the way a ranch is supposed to look, orderly and alive. Jessie came out onto the porch. She leaned against the railing and waited. She had imagined this moment many times in the first year, sometimes with anger, sometimes with longing, sometimes with the elaborate speeches of a person arguing in the shower. But now that it was here, she felt mostly tired. "I heard about the Burkholders," Carl said, "and Retzlaff, and Harlan Sweeney." He shook his head. "Half the county's gone. More than half. And you're still here. I'm still here." He took his hat off and held it in both hands, turning it slowly by the brim. "The oil field laid us off in August, whole crew. Price of crude dropped, and they shut down the rig like turning off a light switch." He looked at the ground. "I went to Omaha, worked at a packing plant for 3 months, stood on a line for 10 hours a day, cutting the same cut over and over, made $11 an hour, and came home smelling like blood." Jessie didn't say anything. She just listened, the way her father used to listen, without hurrying toward a response. "I was wrong about everything, Jessie," he said, and his voice cracked on her name. "I was wrong about the ranch, wrong about your father, wrong about what mattered." He looked up at her. "I'm not asking to come back. I wouldn't ask that. I just needed to stand here and say it." She looked at him for a long time. She saw a man who had walked away from something good because he couldn't recognize it. She felt no anger. She had burned through anger a long time ago, somewhere between pulling calves in blizzards and rebuilding a transmission on a shop floor in February. What she felt was a strange, clean kind of peace. Not forgiveness exactly, but something close to it. An understanding that some people have to leave a place to learn what it was. "You want some coffee?" she said. He looked up, startled. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, I would." They sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee and talked the way two people talk when the storm has passed and they're surveying what's left standing. He didn't stay. When he left that evening, driving back down the gravel lane into the dusk, Jessie stood on the porch and watched the taillights until they disappeared at the curve. The same curve, the same disappearing act. But this time, the silence that followed wasn't the kind that swallows you. It was the kind that holds you up. Now let me take you forward. 3 decades past those desperate years. Jessie Morrow is 61 years old. Her face is lined by sun and wind, and the particular kind of aging that comes from spending your life outdoors in a place where the weather is always trying to make a point. Her hands are strong. Her eyes are clear. She moves with the slow deliberateness of someone who has learned that rushing is almost always a mistake. The ranch is still 900 acres. She never expanded. She never needed to. The grass on her pastures is the thickest in the county, the result of 40 years of careful rotation and rest. Her Hereford herd has been culled and selected and bred with such patience that the calves practically raise themselves. She sells them every fall at the sale barn in Valentine, and they consistently bring the top price, not because they're the biggest, but because the buyers know what they're getting. Morrow cattle are sound. Everybody knows it. The old Ford truck is gone. finally retired in 1996 and parked behind the barn like a monument. Jesse bought a used Dodge to replace it, paid cash, drove it for 15 years, and then bought another used Dodge and paid cash for that one too. The International 806 tractor is still running. Its engine has been rebuilt once by Jessie using her father's binder and a set of feeler gauges and a patience that most people would mistake for stubbornness. The workshop is the same. The pegboard, the craftsman wrenches, the 7 black binders. Jessie has added 3 of her own. They sit on the shelf next to her father's, her handwriting a looser, rounder version of his block print, but the information just as precise. Dates, part numbers, observations. The transmission rebuild of 1982 has its own 2 pages. The men who once shook their heads about her, the ranchers, and the bankers and the county agents, they come to her now. Young people from the agricultural college in Lincoln drive up on weekends to walk her pastures and ask about soil health, about grass management, about how to build a ranch that can survive the next crisis, whatever it might be. She answers their questions and shows them the corrals her father built and the binders her father kept, and she tells them what Emmett Morrow told her. On a warm September afternoon, she's in the workshop with her daughter's boy, Levi. He's 17, tall and quiet, with the long fingers of someone who might be good with tools if someone takes the time to teach him. She's showing him how to pack a wheel bearing on the old stock trailer. "Feel that," she says, handing him the bearing. "Roll it in your fingers. Is it smooth or does it catch?" He rolls it carefully. "It catches," he says. "Right there. Good. That's a pit in the race. Means it's done. You put that back on and run it down the highway. The wheel comes off. A $2 bearing or a $2,000 wreck. Your choice." He nods, serious. She hands him a new bearing and a tub of grease. "Pack it by hand. Push the grease in from the wide side until it comes out the narrow side. Don't use the machine. You need to feel how much grease goes in. The machine doesn't teach you anything." He works at it, his hands getting slick and dark. Jessie watches him and sees for a moment her own hands at that age, in this same shop, with a man who believed that the most valuable thing you could give someone wasn't money or land or even love. It was knowledge, the kind you earn with your hands, the kind that doesn't depreciate, doesn't get repossessed, doesn't depend on interest rates or commodity prices or the opinions of men in clean shirts. Grandpa Emmett kept notes on everything, didn't he? Levi asks, glancing at the binders. "Everything," Jessie says. "He believed if you did a job and didn't write it down, you'd have to learn it all over again next time. And life's too short to learn the same lesson twice." She pulls down the binder marked General and opens it to a page near the back. There, in Emmett's handwriting, is a list. Not a parts list or a repair log, but something simpler. It reads, things that last, good fences, healthy soil, honest count, patient hands, clear records, and the willingness to do the work when nobody is watching. Levi reads it and looks up at her. Did he always know it would work out? Jessie thinks about that. She thinks about the night in the workshop with the broken transmission and the index card. She thinks about the calves she lost and the coffee she drank, with a man who finally said the words she needed to hear 2 years too late. She thinks about the grass, the stubborn, beautiful grass that came back every spring no matter what the winter did to it. "No," she says, "he didn't know. He just did the work anyway." That was the whole secret. The boy nods and goes back to packing the bearing, his hands learning the feel of it, the grease working into the spaces between the rollers, the way knowledge works into the spaces between doubt. Outside, the September sun is turning the sandhills to gold, and the cattle are grazing in the south pasture in a long, loose line that follows the contour of the land. 900 acres, not the biggest ranch in the county, just the one that's still here.